tell us about his perspective on what we've done so far and what we should do in the future. John Lyle. And an aside, he just got back from Japan. When I talked to him last night, he knew where he was, but he didn't know what time it was. So I'm very grateful for him. If I just got back from Japan, I don't think I'd agree to do anything so quickly, but I'm very glad that he's here.
Ron's being kind. I not only didn't know what time it was, I didn't even know what day it was. I figured it out since then, so I hope I can be reasonably. I also brought back a little cough from Japan, which we'll try and keep to a minimum. When Ron first asked me to do this, it conjured up a lot of memories and a lot of thoughts and a lot of groping. Because the request was that I review the original principles that led to the founding of the Center for Regenerative Studies. Since the founding was a long, drawn-out process that took us about 12 years altogether, the ideas evolved a lot, even while we were going through the founding process. So, pinning those down and saying exactly what the original ideas were turned out to be a little bit of a challenge. I read through a lot of the old materials, the original materials, and I found that the ideas were there, but I wasn't very happy with the form they were in. I found that what I really wanted to do was put them into a little bit more coherent form for presentation today. And so there's a lot of deja vu here, but I think also an attempt with the luxury of hindsight to really understand what we were doing 10 to 20 years ago. Thanks, Sean. What I decided was that we could really summarize the ideas underlining the center as 4 general principles. And I want to go through those kind of briefly. And I think that if you have a grasp of those, then you probably understand what the center was intended to be all about, and I think to a large degree still is all about. The first idea was the most obvious one, the idea of regenerative systems. Now, there are several paragraphs in the original project prospectus describing the shortcomings of industrial systems and the industrial means of life support and the fact that it's essentially unsustainable and the fact that we need to develop different ways of doing things, and we in fact are and have been developing better ways of doing things for some years now. And I think that the only, you hear a lot of talk now about sustainability. Sustainability has become a very popular word since we started working on the Center for Regenerative Studies. And the admission of the need for sustainability in our physical environment, I think, is a recognition that the industrial environment that we've designed over the last century or so is not sustainable. It's not sustainable because we dig materials out of the earth, we haul them to places where people live and use them. We use them generally one time, and then we send them off to the waste sinks. That is, it's a one-way flow system, a throughput system. Clearly, that kind of a system is not sustainable because eventually you run out of materials and energy on one side and you overload the waste sinks on the other. And there's no way to resolve that problem without changing the system. The alternative, I think, is regenerative systems, which are based on the fundamental operations of natural ecosystems. Regenerative systems rely for their energy not on fossil fuels dug out of the earth, but on the sun, which supplies us with new energy every day. It is therefore regenerative because it's constantly resupplied. Regenerative systems rely not on a continuing supply of new materials, but on the continual cycling of existing materials, so that there are continuing processes of renewal that always are giving us new materials made from the basic components of old materials. Now those are both basic operations in nature. The idea of the use of solar energy and the idea of continual cycling. And those are the basic ideas of regenerative systems. Now we know now, and we knew then when we started thinking about the center, that it is possible to support human life on the basis of regenerative systems. Enough was known about them, enough research had been done, enough development had been done, that we knew that we can support human life on the basis of regenerative systems. But there are very few examples of actually doing that. We felt that it was extremely important to develop good examples where people can see these things work, know it's possible, know that sustainability is really possible, that the world, the human world, civilization, doesn't have to run down in the next century. Our particular interest was in 5 areas of basic life support, and those are energy, water, food, shelter, and waste. And those were the initial focus areas of the Center for Regenerative Studies, and as far as I know, they still are, although they've been expanded somewhat. So that was the first basic principle. And I think in a lot of ways, it was the generating principle. That was really what we started with. Second idea is one that's pretty commonly heard at Cal Poly, and that's the idea of learning by doing. When I started teaching here about 30 years ago, learning by doing was a subject you heard talked about a lot. You don't hear it so much anymore. I think in some ways we let it drop by the wayside. But I found it extremely effective. I found that students learned by doing at a pace that was far faster than they learned by listening. And so I was much impressed with that when I started teaching here. And I tried to build it into all of my teaching. And when we conceived the idea of the Center for Regenerative Studies, that became an important part of it, with one addition. What we wanted to focus on was learning by doing and by discourse. That is, doing is not enough. Just doing things, you might learn to do things, but you won't learn much about the meaning of those things. So it became important to us not just to do, but also to discuss, to examine, to ask why, and to explore various means. So the discourse is equally important. Doing has to be balanced by discourse. And this gives us a kind of cycle of application and examination. And this was the basic learning method in the beginning of the center. And especially the scientists among you will recognize that this is also a variation on the scientific method. Right? So it's also a basis for research. And what we wanted to do was to integrate research and teaching. The third idea is very closely related to the second idea. And that's the idea of the environment as teacher. Now, regenerative systems span the whole spectrum of basic life support, including essentially the whole physical environment. Now, unless that physical environment is designed in such a way as to incorporate the ideas of regenerative systems, and unless it's designed for learning by doing, it won't really serve its purpose very well. We couldn't sit in a room like this and learn about regenerative systems, right? We have to sit in a room that's designed in such a way as to use the energy of the sun and to be able to see into the outdoors and see the kinds of natural systems we're talking about. So the idea that we wanted to create an environment that would in itself teach was important. And that was really the reason why the Center for Regenerative Studies couldn't just move into an existing building somewhere. It had to create its own environment. Now, educators among you will recognize that this is an idea that comes from John Dewey, who advocated that places for learning should be designed to be teachers in themselves. Not that you don't still need human teachers, but children tend to learn as much from the places where they are as they do from their teachers. The fourth idea developed fairly late in the process, and developed slowly. It's not a new idea, it's an ancient idea. That's the idea of a community of scholars. As we worked with the application of regenerative systems, it became clearer and clearer that regenerative systems must be integrated with the human community. People operate their energy systems themselves, they operate their water systems themselves, they operate their buildings themselves, they manage their own waste. And for a community to do this, they have to work together. They have to cooperate. They have to make decisions together. And so this meant that it was necessary to have a working community. We had to have a group of people who could interact, who could exchange ideas, who could make decisions, who could work as a team in carrying out various projects. That meant that the Center for Regenerative Studies had to create a community. Now, a lot of you are probably aware this is one of the most difficult things the Center has attempted to do. It's difficult because most of us have no experience in living in a real community. The society we live in does not really have communities. And so most of the students and most of the faculty come from backgrounds, primarily backgrounds in middle-class suburbs, where people don't cooperate very much. They're nice to each other, and they'll help each other out on occasion, but they don't form a community in the sense of really interacting, working together as a team, and making decisions together. But again, it's not a new idea. The colleges at Oxford and Cambridge in England are all based on the idea of a community of scholars. A lot of other educational institutions are. The early settlements in the United States were all based on the idea that the community had to work together to survive, and in other places. So it's not a new idea. It's really the revival of an old idea, but one that we decided was extremely important for the future. So those were the four ideas: regenerative systems, learning by doing and discourse, environment as teacher, and community of scholars. And I think, I haven't been involved with the center for more than 3 years now, but I think these ideas are all still alive. I think others have been added, which is good. The center has to grow and evolve. New ideas should be added. These should be expanded and variations developed. So, but looking back, I think this really was the basis. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions, if with your consent, of course. For those of you who are newer or unfamiliar with the center, this is your opportunity.
I think that, from what I know in my personal experience with you, that there's been seed banks. The other idea that I would broker as the fifth idea is that I euphemistically and humoristically call it the spermaculture of permaculture, the idea that you're fertilizing new ideas in other areas, and you've been up to doing that over the last couple of years, so that these ideas that started at the center and took 10 years of incubation are now at least seed banking, if not blossoming, in other areas. And you might comment on that, because I think that what your comment to me was a long time ago, that these are satellites that are going in different areas so that communities would grow around these concepts, because it has to be built around role models and expectation models of people all over, I mean, in regional localities.
Yeah, I think that's it's an important point, and it was part of the original concept, that if we could establish the center and make it work, then it would become a model for other places. And in the beginning, we weren't very conscious about how we would help that come about. But it has happened. And as Bill mentioned, most of my work over the last 3 years has been in designing centers in other places. None of them is exactly like our center. They're all very different, because they're in different places and different situations and different cultures. But I think that's an important role of the center, and I hope it continues to be an important role of the center, that it does influence other people in other places, and it does tend to spin off other centers. Yep.
I have one more question. I saw in teaching there, and also with different other instructors coming to teach there, that you almost have to learn to teach there. You have to be almost as an internship to really grasping how to think integratedly. Or, I mean, I think people like Dick Jacobs that came in at different times and grabbed the bull by the horns in a sense and tried to learn, and other teachers that weren't as successful, how to get into figuring in group mind thinking, the ability that every teacher is a student and every student is a teacher. The kinds of things you're talking learning by doing is a little different than the 19th century academic atmosphere, and so that it took a sort of a quarter at least to get to know how to be in that atmosphere. I don't know if you've seen many people go through it, so you might give some comments on that.
Well, I think that's true, not only of people who came in later, but of the original faculty. It took us a long-term time to learn to teach there. And as Ron mentioned, we offered seminars on the subject for several years before the facility was available. And we kind of practiced our craft in those seminars, and I think learned a lot about how to work with students on this subject. So it took all of us a long time. And you're right, it's not the standard way of teaching. Even at Cal Poly, as I mentioned earlier, learning by doing is not the standard way of teaching, and when you throw in discourse, then it gets a lot more complicated. So yes, I think that learning to teach there is a bit of a challenge for most people.
Do you think
and it's not for everybody. You know, everybody doesn't like to teach that way. That's I think some of us have a particular inclination to teach that way, and others don't. So.
How about students? Is it a particular different for students, you think? Do you seen different? You've seen 3 generations of students go through there.
Well, the students that I knew all took to it really, really well. And I thought that they responded in such a way as if it was almost something they'd been searching for a long time. There were a few who maybe were not so willing to work and think on their own, or to work and think as a group. But that was a very small minority. Most of the students that I knew, that I worked with there, I thought adapted very well to this environment.
We'll get a student's perspective a little later this afternoon. That's actually part of the afternoon's agenda. Thank you very much.